Please be seated. These others must I read them out? Yeah. Good afternoon. We're just waiting for some people to take their seats. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Beverly de Mons from the National Research Foundation, and I will be the facilitator this afternoon at this 2018 Nobel-Inspired lecture on peace. I would like to offer a formal welcome to former President of South Africa, Mr. Kgalema Motlanthe, Her Excellency, Ms. Cecilia Julien, the Ambassador of Sweden, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Hungary, and His Excellency from the European Union, Mr. Rudiger Lotz of the German Embassy, Mr. Olaf Sommel, the Curator of the Nobel Museum in Sweden, members of the diplomatic community, Chairperson of the Public Service Commission, Advocate Richard Cizanani, Ms. Claire Bussetti, the NRF board member, Professor Tawana Kupe, Vice Principal of the University of the Witwatersrand, all the representatives of the universities, members of academia, our student community joining us today, distinguished guests, a very warm welcome to all of you, and many thanks for joining us this afternoon. 2018 has been declared the Mandela Centenary Year in South Africa, and in celebration of this former Nobel Peace Laureate, remember the Peace Laureate was awarded to former President Nelson Mandela in 1993, and we are no strangers to that. Before that, we had Albert Luthuli winning the Peace Prize in 1960 and Desmond Tutu in 1984. So the Peace Prize finds a home in our community. And the National Research Foundation and the Embassy of Sweden in Pretoria saw it fitting to host a lecture on this day on the announcement of the Peace Prize in honor of former President Nelson Mandela, with a keynote address by the former President Kgalema Motlanthe on the vision of Nobel and Mandela, the meaning and challenges for a contemporary South Africa. The University of Witwatersrand is the gracious host for this lecture, and it's sentimental indeed, especially since Mr. Mandela was once a student at this very university. So I think as a host institution, this was a really good partnership for us. The Nobel Peace Prize was established to award people who dedicate their lives to ensure peace in this world, and we know that very well in terms of the gist of what it is that we are going to do and listen to here today. I'd just like to remind you that this lecture will be live streamed on the NRF Facebook page today, that we would like it also to trend on social media, which is the platform of choice for most, should I say people, or the young people especially. And so the Twitter handle for this afternoon is #NRF Lecture. The Twitter name is @NRF_news. So please do use these platforms and share the good word that would be going out today, especially from our main speaker. So at this point, I would like to call to the podium Professor Tawana Kupe, the Vice Principal of the University of Witwatersrand, to offer a welcome.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming to this event this afternoon. President Motlanthe used the title President Motlanthe, because I'm always concerned about when people say former something, then the question is, what are you now? So I think we'll follow the US model and call you President Motlanthe. From here on, ladies and gentlemen, the Master of Ceremonies has already welcomed a number of dignitaries that are here. So allow me to say all protocols observed, and then to make my few remarks and make sure that we go directly to what we are here for, which is the lecture by President Motlanthe. It has already been said, and I'd like to add my voice to this. This is, of course, home of a Nobel Prize winner, Nelson Mandela. And in this very room this year, a number of events in honor of Nelson Mandela as an icon of the liberation struggle and a peacemaker recognized by the Nobel Peace Committee have been held. One which we held 3 or 4 months ago was an event held twice called the Obama-Mandela Legacy. And you know that Mandela, of course, has inspired many other leaders. Obama's inspiration, although he never actually directly met Mandela when he was in office, but also in his years when he was in decline, does attest to the fact that his ideas about peace in the world were partly inspired by Mandela. You also know that there's that curious event where, before he had even spent a year in office, Obama himself was granted a Nobel Prize. And so, in a sense, that he followed in the great footsteps of a Nobel Prize winner. Universities are very important institutions in society. They train, they educate, but they also produce knowledge. I can say, standing here today, that this is one of those leading institutions on our continent whose aim is to produce knowledge that inspires and supports peaceful resolutions to the major challenges of the world. So this, in all of his teaching and in all of his research, is always attempting to contribute to legacies of peace, partly inspired, of course, by the examples that Mandela actually gave. I think it is also very important that today, as the Nobel Peace Prize is announced, and looking at the Swedish ambassador, I hope you will tell everybody who has won the Nobel Peace Prize today that we hold this lecture almost on the same day. And I think it is also befitting that this Nobel lecture is given by President Motlanthe. He has served many roles in our nation, including being for a time president of the country itself, hence the honorific president, and also deputy president of the country. You can say in all of his interventions, when the nation has been at particular points of crisis, that behind his message was a notion that things could be resolved peacefully. To global peace. So I think we're greatly honored that the lecture then could be given by President Motlanthe, who would also have been inspired by Nelson Mandela, and he lived in the shadow of the great man, and also I think he followed in his footsteps. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me say to you, let's hear the President Motlanthe who we have come here for, and let's enjoy the lecture. And thank you very much, President Motlanthe, for accepting to give the lecture, and to everybody else who made sure that this could happen. President Motlanthe.
Thank you very much, Professor, for welcome us all into your home, as it were, onto the campus. I'd now like to call upon the Ambassador, Her Excellency Ms. Cecilia Julien.
We're very happy to see you here. And I want to say also a profound thank you to the National Research Foundation, who have been doing this together with Sweden, the Nobel Lectures, now for the 5th year, but also to the Department of Science and Technology, and of course to the University of the Witwatersrand for hosting us here today. It's a tremendous moment for us to do this, the Peace Lecture, and we're very honored to have President Motlanthe deliver it to us. As you know, this is the week when the different Nobel Peace Prizes are being announced. It started on Monday with a prize in physiology or medicine. On Tuesday, we had the prize in physics. On Wednesday, the prize in chemistry. On Thursday, or yesterday, we should have had the prize in literature. This year's prize in literature has been postponed, and it's due to some internal problems in the Swedish Academy, which is the institution that gives or nominates and appoints the prize in literature. And I can only say that the internal problems in the Swedish Academy has a connection to the Me Too campaign and issue. But today we had the announcement of the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2018. I think, and I think a large part of the world think it's a fabulous choice. There are two laureates. One is Dr. Denis Mukwege, who is a physician from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who has dedicated his life to help victims of sexual violence and sexual violence in the armed conflict going on. And the other recipient is Nadia Murad, which is a young Yazidi woman from northern Iraq who was taken by the Islamic State army together with a group of girls from her village and kept as sex slaves until, well, she and some of them managed to escape. And she has been brave enough to step forward publicly to witness about what she was subjected to. And I think the two of them have really shown the importance of people speaking out. Dr. Mukwege, well, working with the women, but also working a lot of empowering women to strengthen them and prevent the kind of atrocities that they have been subjected to. And I think Nadia Murad, having the courage to speak publicly and standing up for what she was subjected to, I think will be an inspiration and encourage others to speak out, and then we will all unite in combating the atrocities. And so they get the prize for their efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war in armed conflict, which we can see that it's being used at. And this brings me a little bit to the role of women when we talk about the Nobel Prizes. Unfortunately, women have not been too prominent when we look at the list of laureates, especially if we look at the hard sciences, at physiology, physics, chemistry, or the prize in economics. Only 49 prizes in all have been awarded to women, and only 19 of those in the hard sciences. So I'm very glad that this year we have female laureates, both in the field of physics and in the field of chemistry, because I think it's extremely important that we have more female laureates so that they can be an inspiration to other young women, to young female students, to go into the sciences, because even today, the adjustable wrench, the pacemaker, the 3-point safety belt, and up to very modern digital platforms that are necessary today, like Skype or Spotify, that we hopefully, a lot of you, now that it's launched in South Africa, listen to a lot. And once a year, the Swedes bask in the glory of the Nobel Prizes, which brings the attention to our country, but I think most importantly, stimulate and inspire people, and especially young people around the world, to talk about science, to dedicate themselves to the sciences, to literature, and of course the all-important mission for creating peace and understanding in the world. So again, we are very happy to do this together with South African partners, especially with the NRF, with different universities in South Africa and schools. And of course, this year with important personalities like President Motlanthe. So thank you very much for coming and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you for that, Ambassador Julien. Yes, we remain committed to this partnership, but it's really noteworthy for you to point out that we too suffer from the scourge of sexual violence and promotion of the role of women, things that are both close to all of our hearts. So I think there's lots of work for all of us to be done. Thank you for that. At this stage, we would also like to hear from Mr. Olof Sommel, the curator of the Nobel Museum in Sweden, and he tells some of the good story and the background around the Nobel Prizes themselves. And I think over this week, besides the announcements in small dialogues with different communities, there's been lots of feedback and lots of interaction around some of the background to the prizes themselves. So can I welcome to the stage Mr. Olof Sommel.
President Motlanthe, Your Excellencies, thank you first to the National Research Foundation and the Swedish Embassy that has invited me for this lecture. Yeah. And today I'd like to talk to you about the Nobel Prize, which has been mentioned quite a lot today so far still. It is an award that rings familiar. We tend to use it as a shorthand for excellence. It is Nobel class worthy. This is a Nobel laureate. And over the century, it has become a shorthand for excellence. It is based, as Ambassador Julien said, in Sweden. It's based on the foundations of Alfred Nobel's last will and testament, establishing the Nobel Prizes. It is hard to know whether he today could appreciate the global reach of the Nobel Prizes, could appreciate the names that have received it. You get to belong to the same club as Einstein, as Hemingway, as Curie, as Dalai Lama, as Nelson Mandela. The shorthand for excellence is not undeserved. Why then did this start? Why do we have a Nobel Prize? It begins with the young man that carries the name, Alfred Bernhard Nobel, Swedish industrialist and inventor. I say he's Swedish, and that's true to an extent. He's born in Sweden. He grew up in Sweden. But shortly during his childhood, he had to leave abroad. He was raised in poverty from an absent father, mother, 2 elder brothers. But when he was 9, his father eventually turned back into his life. He had then traveled to Russia, working with weaponry for the military. He could bring his family abroad. This was the first foreign trip out of many for Alfred Nobel. So born in Sweden, yes, but educated in Russia. Nobel, I would say, shows the true merit of a broad education. His was an education of sciences, yes, but also of languages, of humanities. By the time he is 17, he's fluent in Russian, Swedish, English, German, French, decent Italian. He dreams of poetry then. He's reading Byron, Shelley. He writes poetry. He's very bad at it. I've read his poetry. It's really terrible. So we are grateful that his father forces him, in a sense, to another career. His father forces him into chemistry instead. Go abroad and study, he says. Germany, France, United States, studying from great masters of chemistry at foreign laboratories. In a sense, he's not a good example because he never actually goes to university. He has no degree in anything. So for that, we should not take Alfred Nobel as an example. But we can take his entrepreneurship to heart. Returning to Russia in the early 1860s, he worked with his father. Dynamite becomes the pinnacle of their collaboration. Explosives are important in this period of time. Railroads are being built, tunnels are being built, mining during the Second Industrial Revolution is crucial. Eventually, Alfred Nobel decides that Sweden is, although pleasant, a bit too far from the rest of the world. He wants to come closer, so he goes to Paris. Paris he likes. He feels it's civilized. He writes, even the dogs are civilized in Paris. I would disagree. And it's from Paris that Alfred Nobel handles his affairs. His business empire grows to be a global one. The shipping routes established earlier on with the first line cruisers across the Atlantic and across the world become crucial. Railroads enable not only a demand for his explosion, but also the transports needed for dynamites, blasting caps, and nitroglycerin. Unfortunately for himself, he doesn't particularly enjoy this. Alfred Nobel wants to be an inventor. Okay, he wants to be a poet, but he can't be a poet, so at least then an inventor. But now, set in Paris, running his affairs, he can't be an inventor either. Now he has to be a businessman. He has to go to meetings. He has to talk with business partners, lawyers, venture capital, we would say today. The Nobel company becomes vast. There are many subsidiaries, many separate stock companies. In Sweden, of course, Germany, France, overseas in the US, South America, Australia, Japan. The final pin to fully globalize the Nobel empire is made in 1896, right here in South Africa, in Witwatersrand, where a dynamite factory set up by the Nobel companies grows up to be a vast company. Needless to say, Alfred Nobel makes a lot of money. And he realizes he has no one to actually give it to. What to do? He decides, well, to give back to society. This is a common theme around the period. The American industrialist Andrew Carnegie writes a call to arms, in a sense, to wealthy people. Give back, he says. Give back to society. Carnegie probably would have disapproved of Nobel. Carnegie felt you should actively give. Nobel gave it in his will when he didn't really, need the money any longer. He writes the will in the 1890s. There are a few earlier drafts, a few letters when he begins sketching on his last will. What should he do? How much should his relatives get? Should they get anything? He felt, we know, that inheritance inherently made you lazy. He uses a term in Swedish called försoffning. It means roughly as of being more and more in a sofa. Encouchment, if you will. This is what inheritance does, Alfred Nobel felt. To put things into context, his nephews, they do get money. 4 or 5% of his total wealth go to friends and family. This is enough to make them multimillionaires by present standards, but not multi-billionaires as Nobel himself. So, then to give it away. He picks fields that he likes. Physics, we've heard, chemistry is what he worked with. Medicine and physiology is his obsession with his health, constant hypochondriac. Literature we can understand. This is the young 17-year-old. He wanted to be a poet after all. The Peace Prize is often quoted as the most enigmatic. Why peace? He blew things up. Admittedly, dynamite was only very, very rarely used for military purposes. But he did, on the other hand, have lots of cannon factories and gunpowders as well. Alfred Nobel was most definitely in the military business. Is it guilt that drives him? This is the standard answer. I recall former President Barack Obama was mentioned that Obama called it guilt in one of his addresses. It's probably not guilt. It's probably being a bit misunderstood. We can see from a letter that Alfred Nobel writes to a friend of his. I believe, he writes, my cannons do more good than your peace conferences. The day two armies can annihilate each other at an instant, all civilized nations will disband their troops. I would argue he was wrong. But those were his firm beliefs. He truly felt that the mutually assured destruction of the Cold War was a good thing. That was the solution. We can see this even further. In another letter, he writes to a friend again, he's considering starting a peace prize. He writes, I'm considering a peace prize. I want it awarded to champions of peace. Once every 5 years, but no more than 6 times in total. Because if they haven't solved it in 30 years, there is no solution. So this is the words of a cynic. But the peace prize he does create, it speaks not of weaponry or mutually assured destruction or terror balance. The peace prize he does create speaks of pacifism. He was inspired by his pen pal, I should maybe say. They very rarely met. Bertha von Suttner, prominent peace activist of the time, writing Die Waffen nieder, lay down your arms. The media, unfortunately, tends to focus more on this part. They tend to focus on the dresses. Who's sitting with whom? What is the queen wearing? What did the king say? We like to focus more on October. What was done? What were the achievements for humankind? Who should we discuss now? Which are the crucial matters of our time? The Peace Prize, then, is something of an enigma. It is the only award that is awarded apart from Sweden. It is the only award that is presented to organizations and not only individuals. Organizations as Amnesty, Médecins Sans Frontières, United Nations, the European Union have been awarded. This year, as Ambassador Julin mentioned, we saw a new addition to the cadre of Nobel laureates with Dr. Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad. Now I'm reading because this is new. Their efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and armed conflict. This is an important prize. It's a prize for human rights. We tend to associate the Nobel Peace Prizes with human rights a lot these days. But it should be noted that this is a fairly new thing. In the early years, the Nobel Peace Prizes were awarded to statesmen, to international organizations, to peace treaties. The first human rights activist to receive the Nobel Peace Prize was here in South Africa. It was Albert Luthuli. The selection of Luthuli as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate opened the door to many more since. Household names like Dr. King, founder of Amnesty, Sean McBride, writer of the Declaration of Human Rights, René Cassin, Desmond Tutu, Mandela, of course. And in recent years, Malala Yousafzai, Kalasiarti, the list goes on. Today we add Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad to their lists. At her speech, the chairperson of the Peace Prize Committee said that this is important. We cannot have lasting peace while sexual violence is rampant in armed conflict. To quote Dr. Denis Mukwege, justice is everyone's business. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Somnol for that background and understanding of something that we might have just read or might have known in terms of the awardees, but to offer an insight into some of the background, especially as it relates to the series themselves. At this stage, we would like to move on to the reason for many of us being here today, and that is for us to take on the keynote address by His Excellency Mr. Kgalema Motlanthe. We are so delighted that our initial request was honored because it is a fitting opportunity to link a Nobel laureate to our address today delivered by Mr. Kgalema Motlanthe. I'm not going to read out this auspicious autobiography and background because if there's anybody in the room that is not familiar with both the President's work and his contribution over a lifetime to our country, then I'm sure you are in the wrong place. So, can I offer the floor at this moment to Mr. Motlanthe? Thank you very much, sir.
Professor Coupe, Excellency Ms. Cecilia Julin, Dr. Mulapo Kobela, Mr. Olaf Sommel, Your Excellencies, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to deliver this lecture marking the auspicious occasion and the centenary of the Nobel Peace Laureate Nelson Mandela. Invoking the name of this iconic statesman and living the human imagination with abundant symbolism that conveys the loftiest ideals of human possibility in the face of profound adversity. Honoring his life and the inheritance it bequeaths, the Nelson Mandela Foundation has entitled its centenary program, Be the Legacy. Such a framing of the heritage that Mandela's life and being vests in us as freedom fighter, global revolutionary, peacemaker, statesman, and human being mandates a keen understanding of the contours of his life, the critical highlights thereof, and lessons that can be gleaned from his conception of democratic tenets as they pertain to humanistic vision for society. Mandela's articulation of a shared vision of post-apartheid society as one founded on inclusive dimensions in absolute imposes exacting obligations on South Africans and the international community. As the modern inheritors of his vision, we are globally enjoined to live within the moral parameters and philosophical paradigm he evidenced through thought, word, and deed. When Nelson Mandela departed the mortal realm on the 5th of December 2013, we were confronted in the immediacy of grief with the question of walking in his footsteps as it pertained most proximately to the South African nation and internationally keeping in mind global dimensions of Mandela's personhood. Nelson Mandela's transcendent universality lent itself to a borderless persona. He served as a figure of idealized proportions, a source of inspiration for global communities who saw within him a symbol of their varied struggles, and in the achievement of a liberated South Africa imagined the possibility of release from contextual empires of domination and relief through entrance into an unqualified humanity. As a metonym and metaphor, his name has become shorthand for the trans-historical values that define human progress. Thus, the man born in Kumves, or village of the Eastern Cape, a rural area, transcended his humble provenance and was catapulted by the tides of history and circumstance to become an individual of notable and international significance. Standing before you, I am ever more aware that Nelson Mandela belongs to the world. Recalling the words of President Barack Obama, who at Mandela's memorial service stated to the South African people, and I quote, "The world thanks you for sharing Nelson Mandela with us." The occasion of Mandela's centenary consequently invites you to share in his legacy. Thus, this address seeks to identify globally relevant lessons and challenges from Nelson Mandela's life. A brief proviso on the mythology of Mandela is necessary. The international statesman was reflexively self-aware of the totalizing nature of iconography and mythology and their amalgamated tendencies to eviscerate the inevitable flaws of human character and in their place construct an unattainable perfect personhood and singular narrative. As a consequence, he drew attention to this saying, and I quote, "I am not a saint unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying," close quote. Such words highlight the humanity we must keep within our vista when thinking the life and meaning of Nelson Mandela and engaging with the imprecise relationship between the recognizable and the knowable. In doing so, we are charged with guarding against the refashioning of Mandela into a figure of ideologically informed propositions used in service of ends that contradict his vision and being. I turn now to the matter of historical context in seeking to outline a brief sketch of Mandela's development as a leader. It is significant that the literal translation of Nelson Mandela's name, Rolihlahla, the first he was given before being bestowed an English name at school, is pulling the branch of a tree. Its colloquial meaning is troublemaker. Such naming would prove prescient, as the freedom fighter would fulfill the inference, proving a thorn in the side of the apartheid government. Grasping the historical formation of Mandela as a leader requires a comprehensive understanding of the inextricable link between the individual and the collective, as his perspective was shaped within the overarching dimensions of the African National Congress, the liberation movement that became the first democratic government of South Africa. As such, his personal and political development is entangled with the passage of historical progressions. Mandela embodied the words of the great American author, James Baldwin, who noted, and I quote, "I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me, certainly, but I'm also so much more than that. So are we all," close quote. The ANC, formed in 1912, represented a parliament of the African people who were excluded from the main body politic on the basis of racially discriminatory legislation that would reach its apex in the system of apartheid, which literally translates into apartness or separateness. This hierarchically organized systemic structure of South African life, inaugurated in 1948, dictated every aspect of being according to race. Tracing a line across the ages, the design of activist energies reveals itself to be shaped by specific historical conditions that necessitate the particularity of designated methods of contestation. As an organization, the ANC was initially defined by a moderate political outlook, being comprised of mostly middle-class individuals and traditional leaders who chose to wage their struggle through constitutionally sanctioned means, including the use of petitions and demonstrations. This reasoned approach would be subject to a profound shift from 1949 onwards, buoyed by the inclusion of workers like Walter Sisulu in leadership structures and occasioned by contextual vicissitudes. Although the choice to pursue an armed struggle in 1960 was initially met with resistance, historical exigency would alter the course of resistance strategies in the wake of the Sharpeville massacre, where police killed 69 unarmed people who were protesting the past laws that governed the movement of people of color. The seminal event would see the organizations of the people, the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, banned under the Suppression of Communism Act, forcing them into underground structures and engendering the introduction of violent measures. Nelson Mandela joined the African National Congress in 1944 and became instrumental in the development of its youth league assisting in the shaping of their radical mass-based policy, the Program of Action, which was later adopted by the ANC in 1949. Together with exemplary leaders like Anton Lembede, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, Mandela formed part of a new guard within the organization, able to envision new political modes brought into being by the violent responses of the apartheid state. In this, we see the emergence of a leader who acutely understood the methods required to establish a new way of being, even when it initially proved unpopular and was subject to rejection. The lesson this confers us demands a studied and brave response to the challenges of our era, knowing that to lead often translates into forming part of an avant-garde, going where none have journeyed before. Explaining the rationale behind such an approach, Walter Sisulu commented, and I quote, "In the face of violence, men struggling for freedom have had to meet violence with violence. How can it be otherwise in South Africa? Change must come, change for the better, but not without sacrifice. My sacrifice, your sacrifice," close quote. Mandela echoed Sisulu's words at the now famous Rivonia trial, where he stated, and I quote, "The hard facts were that 50 years of nonviolence had brought the African people nothing but more and more repressive legislation and fewer rights. It was only when all channels of peaceful protest had been barred to us that the decision was made to embark on violent forms of political struggle and to form Umkhonto weSizwe," close quote. The Rivonia trial serves as a seminal moment in Mandela's life, identifying him as a pivotal leader in the struggle against white domination. It thus deserves attention, as multiple lessons can be drawn from Mandela's conduct and political tactics while in the dock. The event that anticipated the Rivonia trial took the form of a raid on the 11th of July 1963 on the Communist Party-owned Liliesleaf Farm. The farm was the locus of the development of the armed struggle, where the ANC sought to decide on a way forward after being banned by the apartheid government. It became the headquarters of the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, which translates to Spear of the Nation. The following statement from the MK Manifesto captures the atmosphere of this moment. It reads, and I quote, "There comes a time in the life of any nation where there remain only two choices, submit or fight. That time has come now to South Africa. We shall not submit, and we have no choice but to hit back by all means within our power in defense of our people, our future, and our freedom," close quote. The apartheid police raided the farm under the intentions of capturing Walter Sisulu, who had addressed the nation from an underground secret radio and was on the run. Walter Sisulu was a key leader of the African National Congress as well as the South African Communist Party. However, this raid interrupted the meeting of MK High Command. The events of that day saw Gavin Mbeki, Dennis Goldbeck, Rusty Bernstein, Raymond Mhlaba, Ahmed Kathrada, and Walter Sisulu arrested. as well as the plans for guerrilla warfare under discussion, discovered, along with other incriminating documents that included Nelson Mandela's diaries. You will recall that Nelson Mandela was at the time serving 5 years of imprisonment for having left the country without a valid passport. And to his credit, he had asked his lawyers, Joe Slovo and Bob Heppel, to go to Lily's Leaf and find his personal notes and destroy them. But because these lawyers and leaders had a sense of history, they found the notes and asked Arthur Goldreich to hide them. And Arthur Goldreich hid them in the coal bunker at the back of the house. And so on this fateful day of the raid, when the place was turned upside down, Nelson Mandela's notes were found. And this is why he was brought in to become accused number 1 of the Rivonia trial. These discoveries culminated in the Rivonia trial, which would have huge repercussions for the status of the struggle and the reality of apartheid in the global imagination and the perception of its leaders, most seminally Nelson Mandela. 2 anti-apartheid permutations that emerged from the trial deserve attention for the instructional lessons they generate, as the trial indefinitely altered international understanding of the South African context, serving as a key moment that charted the course to the arrival of democracy. The first permutation that emerged from the trial saw the appearance of iconic figures in the firmament of South African history as the theater of court played out. These included luminaries like Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Raymond Mhlaba, Elias Mtswelaidi, Ahmed Kathrada, Dennis Goldbeck, Andrew Mlangeni, and of course, Nelson Mandela. Whilst previously framed as terrorists and communists, through the trial, these leaders became metonymic. They stood in for the larger body of politic of oppressed South Africans, while projecting a vision for the future on the basis of a humanistic conception of society. This served to undermine the moral underpinnings of the apartheid government and its claim to superior ethical tenets by evidencing a superior notion of civilization constructed on democratic grounds. Joel Joffe, in his book entitled The State versus Nelson Mandela, The Trial That Changed South Africa, states that, and I quote, "The accused, of course, had a wider strategy which made the task of the defense far more difficult. Mandela and his co-accused were not prepared to restrict themselves to a straight legal defense. They wanted to go on a political offensive to the courtroom to explain precisely what they were aiming to do and why. They wanted to put the record straight and answer in public the falsifications and distortions of the state," close quote. Rusty Bernstein, in his memoir entitled Memory Against Forgetting, aptly sums up the same interpretation of the trial. And I quote, "Here was the opportunity the underground had sought and failed to find. The opportunity to address the whole country, to explain the reasons why the struggle had to shift from total nonviolence to a combination of violent and non-violent means, to explain why Umkhonto weSizwe had been formed, by whom, and for what purposes. Here at last was the opportunity to break out of the blackout of state censorship and press self-censorship and replace unreliable rumor with an authentic policy guide for the whole people. The Rivonia trial became the platform from which to tell the whole story as it really was, close quote. As accused number one, Nelson Mandela used these propitious conditions to articulate the core of the struggle with remarkable clarity. His statement from the dock would go on to reverberate across the world, positioning him as the face of the movement against white minority rule, challenging the perception put forward by the apartheid government. With astute political wit and lucidity, Mandela presented the moral foundations of the liberation struggle, outlining the circumstances that had occasioned the need for violence. As such, his speech would go on to be widely published and inspire international action at the level of states, intergovernmental organizations, and global civil society. Most notably, the following words found resonance with transnational audiences across all backgrounds. And I quote, "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I fought against white domination and I fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live, it is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die," close quote. This willingness to die for the purposes of a political goal was a perspective that was shared among the trialists. Advocate Bram Fischer, who represented the accused, wrote a letter to a young comrade that expresses his admiration of this position. And the letter reads as follows, and I quote, "I must tell you of one important event. Some days before the end of the argument in court, Gavin, Walter, and Nelson came to an early morning consultation to tell me of a decision they had taken with regard to the sentence if it turned out to be capital punishment. They had made up their minds that in that event there was to be no appeal. Their line was that should a death sentence be passed upon them, the political campaign around such a sentence should not be hampered by any appeal for mercy or by raising any vain hopes. We lawyers were staggered at first, but soon realized the decision was politically unassailable. But I tell you the story not because of its political wisdom. I want you to know to what incredibly brave men you and others will have to be successors," close quote. The Rivonia trial then represents a defining episode in South African democracy. It is a forceful reminder of the radical power of agency. It then follows that Mandela's vision for post-apartheid South Africa must be outlined if we are to understand its global resonance and relevance in contemporary politics. Mandela's vision for democratic South Africa animated his unwavering commitment to national and global liberation. He consistently called for change that would lift vulnerable and marginalized people out of their abject experiences, measuring democracy not by the ballot box, but by the experience of significant difference. As he noted in his inaugural address, and I quote, "We enter into a covenant that we shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, assured of their inalienable rights to human dignity," close quote. Mandela and many of the veterans of the liberation struggle waged their fight inspired by a vision of constitutional democratic state, stable, non-racial, non-sexist, united, and prosperous nation that sought to contribute to a world that is just and equitable. The dream that fired the imagination of Mandela and his comrades was not the inauguration of democracy without substantive change. His statements following the installation of the majority-elected government reveal a commitment to reconciliation and nation-building that acknowledged the long road that lay ahead. Thus, in his autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom, he states, and I quote, "The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. The true test of our devotion to freedom is just beginning," close quote. The state of contemporary South Africa, and indeed many global democracies that contend with historically rooted divisions, serves as a reminder that the structural conditions that underpin the most hideous systems of discrimination are not easily undone. Indeed, upon the arrival of democracy in South Africa, the world looked to the country emboldened by the hope for change in absolute terms. The sheer weight of national and international expectation has proven itself to have been unattainable, given the anticipation of a total evisceration of the past. However, as James Baldwin reminds us, and I quote, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do," close quote. The contemporary South African reality is one that signals Baldwin's great force of history, punctured by poverty, inequality, gendered imbalances, corruption, unemployment, and other social ills, political and economic ills. Thus, post-apartheid South Africa is defined in accordance with a long history of socio-economic inequality based on the notion of race as a fulcrum of socio-economic organization. For a time, the dream of Mandela, to borrow the words of Langston Hughes, appeared deferred. Hope has recently been reignited by a political shift in leadership that has brought with it optimistic sentiments that the vision of the post-apartheid context endures. This hope is underpinned by the South African Constitution, which extends beyond conventional civil liberties to the incorporation of certain socio-economic rights, such as access to sufficient food and water, social security, health care services, and an environment that is not harmful to health or well-being. As Mandela noted, and I quote, "As long as many of our people still live in utter poverty, as long as children still live under plastic covers, as long as many of our people are still without jobs, no South African should rest and wallow in the joy of freedom," close quote. Thus, within our constitution is an injunction to establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights in order that we may improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person to contribute to building a better South Africa. The Nelson Mandela Foundation Centenary Campaign revolves around 3 identified focus areas that correspond with the democratic ideals he fought for. These are: 1, fighting poverty and inequality; 2, striving to eradicate the scourge of racism; and 3, reckoning with our country's oppressive past. Ladies and gentlemen, such challenges are not solely confined to the South African context. The Western world, advanced democracies, and totalitarian regimes continue to strain against the weight of ideology and history that translate into varied experiences of citizenship and the denial of citizenship in the first instance. Our world is ruptured by numerous systems of prejudice and injustices, including racism, sexism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and discrimination on the basis of sexual and gender identities. That such reality defines the contours of experience in the modern epoch attests to the fact that freedom has both new and ancient frontiers, as the experiences of the past continue to haunt the present in ways that appear novel. The life of Nelson Mandela and his conduct as statesman, negotiator, and reconciler demands a transnational understanding of his vision that must be premised on ethical leadership and critical agency in the face of seemingly intractable structural limitations. Therefore, Mandela was recognized for his desire to bring oppressor and oppressed together, for his commitment to find common ground and purpose to rid the country of centuries of racial strife and hatred, to instill a sense of unifying justice that would pave the way for reconciliation, understanding, and nation building. The Nobel Peace Prize was a symbol of acknowledging more than just recognizing Mandela's ideals and principles. It encapsulated and went to the very core and heart of humanity. Alfred Nobel envisioned that the Peace Prize would harness and strengthen international peace and solidarity, and in the process lay the foundations to build the bonds of peace and tolerance between nations, ideals to which Mandela held firm to even against opposition. It is these very key principles enshrined in the Nobel Peace Prize that Mandela displayed coming out of prison as he strove to build a united nation out of the fire of conflict, strife, and bitterness. Bishop Gunnar Stalset, Emeritus of Oslo Church of Norway and Nobel Peace Prize Committee member, recalls in an interview, and I quote, "Having met Mandela, having met de Klerk, knowing they come from two opposing sides in the struggle, seeing them on the same platform, conveying a message of what I would say was reconciliation, their body language was stronger than the words spoken. as I said, one of the proud moments in humanity when hope is not in vain, close quote. A brief aside is necessary in the spirit of humanizing the idea of Nelson Mandela. In the face of insistent hangovers of the past that hamper South African progress, some have sought to cap at Mandela's choices in the negotiated settlement with the apartheid government, particularly concessions made in relation to economic policy and land reform, which remain contemporary sites of contestation. As the adage reminds us, however, hindsight is 20/20. In the immediacy of a moment, the repercussions of our decisions do not reveal themselves with faultless clarity. With a view to context, we must also keep in mind the practical realities that underscored Mandela's negotiations with the apartheid government, which included concerns over violence, apprehensions about divisions among African people, anxiety over the loss of international support and sanctions pressure, the threat of isolation, and of course a stilted process, among other challenges. The atmosphere that caused Mandela to take certain decisions was rooted in his concern that precluding dialogue would lead to a state in which both sides would be plunged into a dark night of oppression, violence, and war. Mandela was a leader who possessed the courage to take unpopular decisions with the intentions of undoing blockages to negotiations and a view to finding lasting solutions. He was willing to plunge into the unknown in order to find the enemy, facilitating multiple breakthroughs and remaining true to his principles, politics, and country. In mounting critique, we are advised to remember that this was a man who, when offered conditional release on the basis of rejecting violence, said, and I quote, "I cherish my own freedom dearly, but I care even more for your freedom. Too many have died since I went to prison. Too many have suffered for the love of freedom. I owe it to their widows, to their orphans, to their mothers, and to their fathers who have grieved and wept for them. Not only have I suffered during these long, lonely, wasted years, I am not less life-loving than you are, but I cannot sell my birthright, nor am I prepared to sell the birthright of the people to be free." Close quote. Nelson Mandela used his time in prison to reflect on the necessary conditions for reconciliation and humanism within South African society. As a result, upon being granted freedom, he walked out of prison without bitterness and resentment and emerged in the mode of a statesman. He was not preoccupied with anything other than achieving a peaceful resolution to the struggle that would require the participation and inclusion of all South Africans. He evidenced a rare ability to rethink time-worn beliefs, which led to his pursuit of non-racialism and support of multiracial platforms. In a time of exacting global divisions on the basis of identity, ideology, nationhood, and experience that is mobilized in the service of separation, the lessons drawn from Mandela's measuring of time, history, and context which underscored the processes he pursued, exemplifies his spirit of humanism and inclusion. As he commented on his prison spell, and I quote, "It was during those long and lonely years that my hunger for the freedom of my people became a hunger for the freedom of all people, white and black. I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. When I walk out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both." Close quote. As he led the government of national unity, anticipating the transition of the South African state, the generation of Nelson Mandela successfully inaugurated the arrival of democracy in South Africa. It is the South African body politic's task to take it further. Program Director, I now return to the question of global challenges and the lessons that can be drawn from Mandela. On an international front, we can be forgiven for asking, where are the statesmen in the mold of Mandela? Apprehending the present condition of global leadership reveals a vast chasm in ethical, moral, and humanistic leadership on a state level. As numerous factors converge in the creation of a more globalized world, we seem to be growing further apart, retreating into our borders, and concerned solely with national interests. Nelson Mandela knew that South Africa's liberation was not separate from the continent. He translated his vision of a free, equal, and just post-apartheid state across the globe, conscious of lopsided global power relations and the increasing authority of multinational corporations. Faced with the realities of climate change, our world requires leaders who evidence Mandela's character, moral certainty, and pursuit of peace, as it is haunted by new authoritarian regimes that bring with them the threat of war, deepening divisions across historical lines, and the inauguration of a new epoch of tense national and geopolitical relations and modern technological powerhouses. Contemporary necessity demands the advent of leaders who are equal to the challenges of our time and untainted by the trappings of power, corruption, and other sins of incumbency, lest we fall into the hollow of historical disputes. Such a tension presents itself in the ongoing conflict between Greece and Turkey, as well as the trade war between China and the United States of America. The spirit of statesmanship, negotiation, and reconciliation that Mandela embodied makes a call for peace through dialogue. Mandela tasks us with the creation of a transformed state of global politics premised on the recognition of the humanity of each individual and conditions that enable prosperity, justice, peace, and security. In closing, Nelson Mandela exists as a towering figure in the human imagination. Transcending his posthumous condition, he has entered into the domain of the immortal. His depth of conviction, more moral character, and humanistic ethos renders him beyond the frail condition of humanity. The statesman's universal message of liberty, equality, justice, and peace for all, the courageous actions that he demonstrated, and the figure he cuts in the imaginations past and present has led to his treasured, iconized position in the global arena. He belongs at once to his family, the liberation movement, South Africa, the continent of Africa, and the international community as his memory endures. Such condition is captured by the words of our own South African poet laureate, Professor H.E Kgalema, who wrote, and I quote, "But memory, defiant like the sound of pain, rides the wave at dawn in the narrow of the desert palm, stands looking still, and the bitter shape of yesterday's weaves timeless tomorrows in the leaves of laughter larger than singular birth." Close quote. Program Director, I hope that this 2018 Nobel-Inspired Peace Lecture will contribute towards the body of knowledge of Mandela and his relevance for the global politics today as we pursue the construction of a better managed and humane world. And I thank you for your attention.
I think that deserves another round of applause, don't you? President Motlanthe, thank you very much. I think this afternoon in speaking, you said that history must be present in all that we do, and I think in the room today, history was alive and present. And you've taken us on a journey recalling seminal moments in the individual life of a great leader, Nelson Mandela, and how they became seminal moments in the life of the collective history of our country, and not only our country, but ensuring reverberations on a global scale. And I think for this we thank you today, because there's been lots that you have brought back to mind, and especially in light of what the lecture series wants to do, which is to create dialogue, and in this case, peace through dialogue. We say thank you once again. The President, in that same spirit, President Kgalema Motlanthe has offered to take one or two questions from the floor in line with the lecture, in line with peace dialogue. And if there are one or two burning issues, we would open the floor.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. It is Nkateko with the Daily Maverick. If I can pose two short questions. My first question would be, because you mentioned the 1994 negotiation process and the thought Mandela had and context around it. Do you think had a different political movement was in charge of the negotiation, let's say the Pan-African movement, for example, how would have things gone if it was them instead of the ANC or instead of Mandela? My second question is that over the past couple of months, you've received criticism over your comment regarding traditional leaders and the land debate. And in your thoughts, in your opinion, what is the best way moving forward in handling the land issue in South Africa? Thank you.
I answered it?
Do we want to take just one more?
Okay. Just
Just one more question then? Thank you.
answer this question.
Just one more and then we...
Okay.
Thank you, President Motlanthe, for the discussion. President Mandela, especially during his term as president from 1994 to 1999, is often kind of talked about as a celebrity or a more ceremonial president. I'd like to get your take, not so much on Mandela the symbol, but on Mandela the statesman, and how much he actively governed. And maybe if you could share one or two anecdotes from your time working with him when he was a very active or hands-on president, rather than more of a symbol.
Thank you. I think we take those.
Okay. Thank you. Well, Governor Mbeki taught us that the Battle of Eves have never been won. And what I mean by that is we can have as many postulations as we want about a certain moment in history and change the main players. That would not make us any wiser. It would not lead to any better understanding, because if you say what would have been the outcomes of the negotiations, were it that instead of the Mandelas, other political leaders, for instance, from the Pan-Africanist Congress, were the dominant interlocutors. Because you start with an if, that's why we say the battle of the ifs has never been won, because you can do those permutations as much as you like. It will not change the reality. That's why history is about facts. And it is important when we learn history that we understand that it gives us context. So let me leave that, your first question on that point. With regards to the land question and the reaction of the traditional leaders to the high-level panel report. That panel was established by the Speakers Forum, which is made up of the Speaker of the National Assembly, the chairperson of the NCOP, and all 9 speakers of the provincial legislatures. And so they tasked the panel with a responsibility of assessing impact of legislation passed since 1994 in 3 broad areas of focus. First one being poverty, unemployment, and inequality, as well as creation of an equitable distribution of wealth. The second area of focus being the land question, land reform, land restitution, land redistribution, as well as security of tenure. And the third area of focus is nation building and social cohesion. And we had to look at all the laws. So our first step was to create a compendium of all laws relevant to these areas of focus. Thereafter, we went out to all provinces to listen to the views of ordinary South African citizens, sharing with us their lived experience as to whether these laws improve improved the quality of their lives or complicated their lives. And we organize round-table discussions with experts. We called for written submissions from stakeholders, and we ended up with tomes of information and had to work through that. All of this information is available on the parliamentary website, and we had to craft a report mindful of our own experience. I served very briefly as a member of parliament, and so we were mindful of the fact that if you present a daunting tome of a report to parliamentarians, they simply don't have the time to read it. And so we did an executive summary and formatted it such that all recommendations were located in boxes, so that if you want to zoom into the recommendations, you just read what is in the boxes. And then, of course, we submitted our report to Parliament, to the Speakers Forum. They farmed out, what the National Assembly did was to farm out various chapters and recommendations to several of the portfolio committees that exist in Parliament. And to date, they have not, as a Parliament, acted on the recommendations of the high-level panel. Our recommendations were very simple, that the wars of dispossession and resistance aside, the wars were fought for almost 200 years. But the dispossession was effected through legislation. And so our attitude was that we need to use legislation to address that injustice, as enjoined by the Constitution. The Constitution recognizes that, the injuries of the past ought to be healed, and that the injustices ought to be addressed. And so land hunger and dispossession serves as the basis of national grievance among the majority of South Africans. Now, Section 25 of the Constitution directs Parliament to pass a law of general application, and I'll explain its relevance in a minute. So our recommendation was that the first step would be for the legislators, the people who asked us to go and do this work, to pass a law of general application as directed by the Constitution. And mindful of the fact that they may never really get around to it, we even took the liberty of sitting down with law experts and crafting a law of general application as a bill. So in the recommendation, we say to them, please pass this law as directed by this Section 25 of the Constitution, and the law must look as follows. So we called it an indicative bill. Of course, the final wording and formulations will be done by parliamentarians. So that's the first recommendation. Second one was that land hunger is primarily pronounced in the urban areas than in the rural areas. And so all the people who live in the townships suffer from lack of tenure security. And so our recommendation was they must be, because the land has been surveyed and demarcated, they must be issued with title deeds. There's nothing more to prevaricate about. They've been paying rent for ages. They must be issued with title deeds. Once they hold title, that gives them an asset. And because a title deed is a commercial instrument, it will change their status from being propertyless to being propertied and holding an asset. That's the second recommendation. The third one, we say annually there are almost 1 million farm workers and farm dwellers who get evicted from the farms. They need to be given security of tenure. There's a famous case which is coming before the Constitutional Court of the Msiza in Natal, in KZN. The family has lived on a farm and occupied a piece of land on that farm, farmed their own portion, and had a commonage for the grazing of their own cattle from 1930. And so we say they must be given security of tenure in legislation so that they should no longer be vulnerable to evictions from the farms. Third category, we go into the villages in rural land has not been surveyed and demarcated. And because of that, our recommendation is that that would take an inordinate amount of time. To survey takes a lot of time and lots of money. So we recommended that all that needs to happen is that GPS technology should be used to record where people are living now as of today, and treat those as recorded rights so that the rights should be given recognition in law and therefore grant them security of tenure. This category applies to people who live in rural areas, in the former homelands, some under jurisdiction of traditional leaders, others outside of that. And so with that recommendation, we believe that the majority of aggrieved South Africans can have their land hunger satiated by just taking those steps. Then, just to explain what Section 25 says about expropriation, it actually says the government or the state has the right to expropriate land in public good or public interest. Now, public interest is you want to build a clinic or a school, you can expropriate that piece of land for public interest. You want to settle people, you can do the same. It then says where compensation is required, in order to determine the level of compensation, you must take the history of how that land was acquired into account. Was it bought? For how much? Was it a subsidy from government? Was it a loan which was converted into a grant? That's the first factor that you must take into account. the history of the place. Now, in the Caesar case, I must just digress for a second. In the Caesar case, the farm was, it's a farm that, trades in wood, in timber. So they cultivate forests on the farm. The farm was bought for 400,000. That's the history of it. But the owner, once the family said they need security of tenure, the portion that they occupy and use, the owner said to government, he needs 4.8 million. Not for the whole farm, for that portion. And so this matter ended up in court, in the lower court, in the land court, and the presiding judge, who, of course, the land claims court has no permanent judges. This is one of the problems we uncovered. It relies on acting judges. So at that time, the acting judge was none other than Advocate Tembeka Ngugaitobi. And he used his own calculations and said, no, 1.5 is adequate. And this farmer was still aggrieved, so he took it on appeal. The appeal court raised it to 1.8. And he still appealed, that's why it's coming to the con court. Of course, he will lose it at the con court. There's no doubt about it. So I'm just giving you a sense of what happens when a property owner or trader has to deal with government. They just inflate the price. Yeah. So anyway, the first factor is that you take the history of, how the property or the land was acquired in the first instance. The second factor to be taken into account is, what is it being used for now as we speak? What is it being used for? And the third factor to be taken into account is, are there any improvements that were made on this land? And even that, you have to take into account whether it was grants or loans and so on. Then the fourth factor is, what is the going rate in the market at the time? So you can see in the sequence that many farmers, you would find that there's very little compensation to be paid. But you see, because people just think of the Mala land deal. The Mala land deal was a scandal, actually. Because what happened there, the successful claimants of the property relied on the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform. And that department paid $1 billion for the Mala piece of land and the lodge there. And the owners took their money, sold it away in their private accounts. Then the department came back to them and said, look, don't move, don't go anywhere, because we want you to stay put so that you mentor the beneficiaries. So they continue to manage the place, and the department says, you now own 50% of the business. I think it was a scandal that really smells to high heavens. But this is what happens in this country of ours. So the traditional leaders have been lobbying the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs that in the rural areas and villages, the land must be given to them as traditional leaders. Now, there's no historical basis for that whatsoever. Land has always been owned traditionally by households, not by the traditional leaders, historically. But they are now saying no, they need, the only ones that are clear are the traditional leaders in the Eastern Cape, because they state up front that no, they don't own the land, they are custodians. The land belongs to the people, you see. Now, so they have been lobbying government that the land must be given to them. And the reason they were not happy with the recommendation of the high-level panel was because the high-level panel's recommendation is that the land must be given to all the villagers. And their households must be given so that they have security of tenure, because in their testimonies, they shared with us how, for instance, let me use the obvious example of the Ingonyama Trust Act. Now, the Ingonyama Trust Act, in my office I have, the 1994 ballot paper. You would not have seen it, most of you, but those who voted in 1994 will remember that right up to the 24th of April 1994, remember, the elections were held on the 27th. Right up to the 24th, the IFP was not going to participate in the elections. And so they were included. They were not included in the ballot paper. They did not appear on the ballot paper. So on the 23rd of April 1994, Nkosi Magosi Tuptelezi, whose main aim was to preserve the KwaZulu homeland. Because remember now, you are going to have, initially they argued for South Africa to become a federal state. But when they lost that argument, that South Africa would be a unitary state, it meant that there would be no homelands. But Buthelezi held out and said, no, he's not participating, they are not going to participate in the elections. And so, on the 23rd, an agreement was arrived at with the old parliament in Cape Town, which allowed for KwaZulu homeland legislature. Their very last act as a legislature of a homeland, they passed this Ingonyama Trust Act and located all the KwaZulu homeland land in this trust. And Isilo Samabandla, the king, was made the sole trustee in this trust. Of course, they did other things. They added some townships which originally were never under the jurisdiction of the homeland, like Omadadeni in Newcastle. And then they also took the Umnini Trust. There's a place in the south coast which even in the apartheid days used to have a holiday resort with access to the beach for Africans. It was the only place, it was very popular, called Umgababa. Umgababa, that community was moved in 1851 from where the oil storage tanks in the Natal Harbor, Devon Harbor is. So they were moved from there to the south coast, and a trust was created for them. It's called Umnini Trust. So they took this Umnini Trust and threw it into the Ingonyama Trust. So the people who all along were able to run a holiday resort there now find that they pay double rental. They pay rent to the Ingonyama Trust board and to the local chief. In fact, one of them was actually taking the Ingonyama Trust board to court for having ruined his business. Now, ordinary people came and testified that they are now being forced by the Ingonyama Trust Board to convert their PTO certificates. In the homelands, people were issued with what was called PTO certificates. It's called Permission to Occupy certificate. So they are now compelling people to convert their PTO certificates into leases. And the lease agreement is no different from a lease agreement you sign with a landlord here and anywhere else. Firstly, the rental starts at 1,600 per annum and escalates at 10% annually. And so the board collects, the reason why they were so upset by the recommendation of giving the land to the households is because the board collects 96 million per annum of rental. And they don't account for that. That's their slush fund. And of course, the king, as you know, also gets an allocation of 66 million from the fiscus for the maintenance of for the upkeep of the royal house. And then they have this 96. So the 96 million rand was the source of their complaint. They are not prepared to lose that. And of course, they reacted as a class of rent seekers that they asking the question, what would happen to their status as traditional leaders if their subjects own the land? Now, no one says the traditional leaders must not own land. The recommendation is that they, like all their subjects, must own the land. And so the mobilization of traditional indunas in KZN was based on a distortion of the report, actually. Because what they were saying was that the high-level panel recommends that the land of the Zulus must be taken away from them, when in fact the opposite is true. But of course, you know, the politicians, of course, started developing, you know, clay feet and so on. And now we had, you know, for instance, the leaders of the ANC in KZN saying, no, the high-level panel never consulted us. We were never consulted. So we don't know. We have got nothing to do with this report. But you see, they are represented in the legislature as well as in the National Assembly. They actually are the owners of the report and the recommendations. But in public, they actually say, no, we were never consulted. We don't know anything about this report and so on. So I'm giving you all this account because this is a matter that's still being debated. And all I'm saying is, if only they can pass this law of general application, issue people with title deeds in the urban areas, and give security of tenure to the farm dwellers and farm labor tenants, and the villagers, same recognition of their rights. There's another problem of communities which reside where there are mineral deposits. Mining houses apply to the Department of Mineral Resources for license to mine. And once that department issues them with the license, the surface rights of the community which lives there are expropriated without compensation, forthwith. And this is what the communities were telling us. So that's why we said even the MPRDA must be amended accordingly in order so that it cannot trump the security of tenure of these villages. They must be compensated accordingly because when they own, but because now they don't own, they lose their surface rights. Right? That's the land question. Is your question, sir?
Thank you. When President Mandela passed away about 5 years ago now, I think the obituary in The Guardian referred to him as largely a ceremonial president and stated, for example, that he did little more than shake the hands of the Spice Girls and other celebrities. I'm wondering whether you think that characterization of President Mandela as a president from 1994 to 1999 is accurate? And if you think it is not accurate, can you give a few examples, maybe during your time as Secretary General, during the end of his presidency, when he was actively involved in governing?
Well, President Mandela ascended to office at the age of 76. And he was the first one to admit that he accepts that responsibility only because he has to manage the transition. Otherwise, he said his age would not permit him to serve more than one term. And that's why he put it that way up front and left when the term ended. But as someone who understood the importance of transition, well-managed transition, he allocated most administrative responsibilities to his deputy president, who was President Mbeki, so that he became like a titular head of state, dealing with the responsibilities of a titular head of state, and left the day-to-day running to President Mbeki. But right up to his retirement, he was in charge and alive to everything. Because Mandela was old school. He kept a pen in his top pocket and took copious notes. In any meeting he attended, he would be taking notes himself in his own handwriting. I remember in the meetings of the National Executive Committee, if the meeting is set for 9 o'clock, he leaves his office at 10 to 9 to be seated at 5 to 9 in his chair to preside over the meeting. And the team that managed him Barbara Masekela, Frini Jinwala, Jesse Duarte would say to him, no, Tata, people are not yet seated, the meeting, and so on. And he would stand his ground and say, no, I'm going there because if you want me to go after 9 o'clock, they will think that I'm the cause of the delay. So I must be seated at 9 o'clock. And so he would move into the venue of the meeting and take his seat and preside over the meeting. As and when the latecomers roll into the meeting, he would have a piece of paper taking down their names. And never, he would not say anything. He would not say anything until it is time to break for lunch. And just before he adjourns the meeting, he then calls all of their names and apologizes profusely to them for having started the meeting before they arrived. And would commit that it would never happen again. And believe me, after lunch, none would arrive late. They would all be seated on time. So he was still in charge of processes and made the time and trouble to inform himself. Even when he was out of government and was no longer, in any of the leadership positions in the ANC, he still, as Secretary General, I had to keep him posted with all the documentation and so on. And from time to time, when he believes there's an important matter, he would convey his views on that matter. Thank you.
President Motlanthe, thank you very much for your time. Graciously offered to us. I think that was an engaging opportunity. I would like to call on CEO of the NRF, Dr. Malapo Kobela, to offer a vote of thanks and to close the meeting. Thank you.
Mr. President, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, I think at one level we came to listen to the former president giving us a lecture on the vision of Nobel and Mandela. And I want to start by thanking him profusely for, as usual, a thought-provoking lecture. You force us to think. You force us to reflect. And for those of us that are within a knowledge environment, a university, a foundation that supports knowledge, we appreciate deeply your challenge to us to think, because we cannot advance knowledge without new ideas and without thinking deeply about what is it that we are doing and why we're doing it. Similarly, the lecture has given us a whole host of take-home lessons. All of us are probably taking whatever lesson you want to take, but one that I want to maybe sprinkle is this time next year we would be 25 years into our democracy. We are a young democracy, 25 years of freedom since '94. There are many in this room who are looking forward to a further 25 years where our country 50 years hence, post-democracy, will be better than what it is today. The world hopefully will be better than what it is today. And what it will require, as I hear from you, Mr. President, is leadership. And a leadership in the qualities of individuals like our former president, President Mandela. And I think it is important, particularly for those of us that are slightly younger than me, to hopefully hold on to those ideals, because hopefully in this room will be individuals who might be Nobel laureates, individuals, Mr. President, who might be sitting or standing in this podium, giving a lecture as presidents of our republic. And I hope that it is a lady. But more importantly, Mr. President, I want to thank you very much for giving your time. It's not, we don't take it for granted. It's not every day that a president graces us with his or her presence. I want to thank Ambassador, our good friend, Ambassador Julian. We have been doing this now for 5 years. Sweden has been an incredible supporter of our country. Prior to democracy, throughout our democratic, thank you, throughout our democracy, and we are hopeful that you will be with us long beyond. And the relationship that we have crafted together as between our two countries, and also in partnership with you, Madam Ambassador, I'm hopeful it will continue and be strong and be strengthened further. To the university, Acting Vice Chancellor, please give our best to the other Vice Chancellor when he returns, Professor Habib. Thank you for being such a gracious host. And lastly, to those that came. You came to listen to a Nobel lecture. You also got a mini lecture. You got 2 for the price of 1. You got a mini lecture on land. And for those that did not come, you tell them next time that when there is a lecture at Solomon Mahlangu House at the Senate chambers, you should come because you will be inspired. And I want to thank the President for those words. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Join us. Mr. President, I'm told I have to give you a gift. But now, what sort of gift do we give to a president? I think it's a book.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much. No, I doubt if it requires declaration.
I'll take my bottle of wood.
Yes, sir. Please join us outside for small cocktails. Oh, photo. Oh, I see.